Hello, good evening, my only sisters and brothers. I forgot to turn on that timer countdown at the beginning, but we got it on. It's so funny. That was Moshe Storch singing Eliyahu Hanavi. I was just talking with him earlier. First of all, let's have a big mazel tov from the AT community for Moshe Storch. You've seen him on our show many times playing music, and he and his wife Simcha just welcomed a new baby boy to their family. Great mazel tov to him. And we were talking about that I want to get more music for him for these countdown timers. And he says, so you want 2-minute pieces? I said, no, they should be 3-minute pieces because you never know. Sometimes you might need a little extra time. And just today, I forgot to turn on that timer. At any rate, let's light up the darkness. Who's going to be with us on this lovely Thursday evening as we're so excited that Shabbos is only a day away? Stephanie Marie Diaz says Shalom Aleichem. Melissa Itel Jurin says good evening from Great Neck, New York. Michelle Vizina Peterlin says Shalom. Stephen Geger from Dover, New Hampshire. Yehudit Sobel from Florence, South Carolina. Allison Townley, great to see you. Randy Lieberman, Herman Shalom from Florida, Sandy McMurray from Michigan, Nancy Brundemel Wright from Southern Pines, North Carolina, where it's hot, hot, hot. Monica Weish says Shalom from Albuquerque. Paul Kunis, Shalom from Minneapolis. Scott Gregory, good evening from Columbus, Ohio. Lorena Nikki says hi. Maggie Lynn Scott says Shalom from Ostrander, Ohio. Amy Kulessa says good evening all. Lorena Nikki is with us from Pennsylvania. Nasir Ali says hi. Brent Robinette, hello from Bremerton, Washington. And Yora from Merced, California. Elizabeth Reeves from York, Pennsylvania. Irene Kleindorf from Broward, Florida. Patrice Carter from St. George, Utah. Bill Eldridge in the house says Shalom from Arkansas. Bill, I've got an answer to the question you asked yesterday, and it was addressed in today's daf. James Roth from Indianapolis. Gwen Strong says, welcome to my home. Karen Halima Flowers is with us from Indianapolis. And Travis Lightcap says shalom from Ohio. Sammy McIntyre says shalom. And Martin Lee says shalom from Duluth, Minnesota. Duluth. And over on YouTube side, Marjorie Holler and Lynn in Texas are with us. All right, let's get into it. Where are we holding? Where is it? It's Daf 25, Daf Chuf Hey of Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 2, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 4. Yesterday, we were talking about a karpef. So this is an enclosure that is not part of a residence, although there was a distinction if it was originally built for the purpose of a residence and then it became unattached to a residence, or if it was not built originally for a residence. So we learned that if it was one that was originally not fenced in for a residence, so its maximum size is 2 base seah, which means the area needed to grow 2 measures of grain. In other words, 5,000 square cubits, which is the same size as the courtyard of the tabernacle, which was the center of the encampment and where the Ark of the Covenant rested, as well as the altar and where the priests did their priestly function within the encampment in the wilderness. Very good. And today, well, actually, at the end of today, we're going to look at a Talmudic insult that was leveled by one sage at another with a reference to his lineage. It was actually a backhanded compliment with a reference to his lineage, which is directly mentioned in the Bible, the lineage of Eli, the high priest, who's mentioned in the book of Samuel. And we'll get to that later. But when Eli was the high priest, it was when the children of Israel were already living in the Holy Land, but still worshiping at the tabernacle in that period of about 400 years between when Joshua led the children of Israel into the land of Israel and before the temple was built in Jerusalem. We'll come to that later. All right, today we start by looking at another strategy when we have an enclosure that is larger than that maximum size, 2 base seah, and it was originally built not for a residence. So now we can't carry there on Shabbos. It doesn't meet the requirements of an enclosure within which on Shabbos we can carry if we need to, right? Carry an object more than 4 cubits as if we're in the public domain, even though it's enclosed. So another strategy, so yesterday we saw that one strategy for doing that was we could tear down part of the fence and then rebuild it, and it will be as if we've built a new fence, and the new fence was built for the purpose of a residence. Now it's now we're saying that this enclosure, even though there may not be a house in it, it's built for the purpose of putting a dwelling there, and then its maximum size is much larger, and it's going to be permitted to carry there on Shabbos. Today we're going to look at a different strategy, not tearing down part of the fence and rebuilding it, but rather, what if we reduce the size? So now we're going to meet that size requirement. So the first strategy that is suggested by the Gemara is, well, what if we plant a bunch of trees in a portion of this enclosure, so that the way we look at it is the part with the trees in it we're not going to use. The part without the trees in it is now going to be less than the 5,000 square cubits. Is that going to count as a reduction in size so that now we can carry, at least in the part of the courtyard that we're calling the reduced courtyard? Answer, no. Trees are not going to accomplish that for us, because trees, as we saw yesterday, are often found in courtyards. If they are there as if they're there as an orchard, in other words, productive trees that we're going to harvest olives or nuts or fruits from them. So that's certainly not going to take us into the realm of a dwelling, nor is it going to count as reducing. And they could be ornamental trees, which are found throughout courtyards. Trees are not going to be an effective way to reduce the size of the courtyard so that we can carry there on Shabbos. However, this is interesting, a column will. Now, this image I think is pretty funny. Here we go. Let me just get this in front of us. Okay, so we have this enclosure. Now this is a karpef, all right? So it was enclosed not for the purpose of a dwelling, but it is exactly, this is the key, it's exactly 2 base saw. It's exactly 5,000 square cubits. Let's say that the dimensions of this enclosure are exactly 50 cubits by 100 cubits. So look at this little column in the middle. A tree, you put one tree there in the middle, it won't help. But you put a column, and that column, this lonely little column, it has to be at least 10 handbreadths high and 4 handbreadths wide. So if it satisfies those measurements, what have we done? We've actually created a new private domain at the top of that column. It's its own private domain. As we've seen, if you separate something by a barrier that's a height of 10 handbreadths, whether it's a fence or it's at the bottom of a pit, or we build up with this column, the 10 handbreadths difference separates it from the ground around it. At the top, it has to be significant. So it's going to have an area of 4 handbreadths, let's say 2 by 2. Okay, so now what have we done? We've subtracted those 4 square handbreadths from the 5,000. And it took us from an enclosure that was exactly at its maximum, and now we've made it less, right? We've made it less. It's less than the 2 base saw. Let's say before it was a hair over, now it's less. And because it's now smaller than that maximum size, it's going to be permitted to carry there. That column is going to be effective of bringing us marginally below that absolute limit. Yesterday we talked about how sometimes just a little incremental difference produces a qualitative transformation, and that would be this case. We were right at the edge, it was just a little too big, and now we've displaced just a little bit of area within the 5,000 square cubits, and now we're under the limit, and it's going to be permitted to carry there on Shabbos. Another strategy would be to build a fence, an inner fence, as it were, and so that's going to be like this. We have this courtyard. It's going to be too big, And now I'm not sure why the dwelling is there, because that's a different rule. But the key here is that we're going to make an inner fence. That's the key of what we're doing there. So we're going to make another fence within the fence. We're still going for that strategy of reducing the size so we get inside that maximum limitation. Will this new fence within the enclosure, as we saw, it's just along one side of the four sides, is that going to be effective in reducing the area so that we get inside the maximum limit? Answer, yes, as long as that new fence is more than 4 handbreadths inboard, as it were, of the old fence. And Rabbah would say as long as it's more than 3 handbreadths inside, right? There has to be a gap of at least 3 according to Rabbah and at least 4 according to the other sages between this new fence that we're adding and the old one. Why? Because of the principle of lavud. In other words, if that new fence is less than that, let's say it's only 2 handbreadths away from the old fence, so then it's as if it's the same fence. It's not a significant change. We haven't reduced the size enough so that it was a significant change. The word for that is chashav, significant, and that's a good word to know. If you're sort of traveling in the religious Jewish world, especially in the yeshivish Jewish world, this word chashav, when you say that somebody is chashaver, right? It's like it's a significant person. It's an important person. It's a way to describe somebody as a kind of a VIP in their community. Perhaps because they support important causes or because they're an important teacher. Whatever it is, it's a significant person. And it's the same idea that it has to be a significant distance away from the old fence so that we can really consider it a new fence that reduces the enclosure. But then we get a new teaching that says that looks like that seems to contradict it, and it says we can make a plaster on the old wall. Now, the plaster itself has to be significant enough that if we remove the old fence, the plaster would still stand, right? So it's not like a plastering job that's a few millimeters thick. It's some kind of like a heavy plaster. It can be touching the old fence, but if we remove the old fence, it would still stand. Now, that contradicts what we just said, because obviously it's as if we built a new wall, and it's certainly less than 4 handbreadths away or even 3 handbreadths away. It's touching. So why is it that plaster job, as long as it's a significant plaster job where this plaster barrier would stand even if we remove the old one, is going to be valid, but a new fence that's less than 3 or 4 handbreadths away from the old one is not? It's just a contradiction. Rav Steinsaltz makes a note, and he says commentators have looked at this contradiction in various ways. One way to explain it is, what exactly are we trying to do? Are we trying to reduce the size, or are we trying to fence it in anew for the purpose of making this a dwelling? And that's why probably in this figure he added that little house, right? Because the idea there is it was originally built not for a dwelling. Now that we're adding a new fence to it, we're saying it's for the purpose of making a dwelling. Or the plaster might be working on the theory of, all we want to do is it's exactly the right size, it's exactly over the limit, and this new barrier is going to bring us within that maximum size. And so it's going to be permitted, not because it's for the purpose, or a new fence for the purpose of a dwelling, but because we've shrunk the overall size to under 5,000 cubits. It's sort of two philosophical approaches to how we're going to make a correction so that we can carry within this enclosure on Shabbos. Good. New principle. If we are making a new partition, now we've just been talking about making a new partition on one end of the enclosure, and we're going to bring it inboard of the old enclosure. What we can't do, so let's say we were going to create a new fence for the purpose of dwelling, not because we're trying to adjust the size, but because we're calling it a new fence. Yesterday we talked about we would tear down part of the fence and replace it with a new fence. A question is, could you just build a new fence on top of the old fence? Does that count as creating a new fence? Answer, no. Creating a new partition on top of an old partition does not make a new partition. It's as if you simply added vertically to the old one, and it's not going to have a legal significance. This question gets asked in the context of an interesting problem. Let's say there was a convert to Judaism. So a non-Jew became a Jew by choice. Now, I think in the Christian world, I really don't know anything about Christian theology and religiosity and Christian theory, as it were, but I've heard the term born again. I'm not going to go into a discussion of what that means in Christianity. In Judaism, when a non-Jew becomes a Jew, it really is as if he's born again. And that's why when a convert becomes Jewish, they acquire a Hebrew name, right? Like my Hebrew name is Yoel. I received that name when I was born. When somebody converts to Judaism, he picks a name for himself, maybe in consultation with his rabbi, but it's his choice or her choice. They take on a Hebrew name, and then a Hebrew name is also always associated with the parent's name, right? So we'll say we associate with the father's name, for example, when somebody's called up for an honor in the temple to read from the Torah. And we associate with the mother's name when, God forbid, somebody needs a healing because they're ill, right? So, God forbid I was ill, we would say, please, pray for Yoel ben Babet, Yoel the son of Babet, my mother's name. If I was called up for an aliyah to the Torah, I would be Yoel ben Avinoam, according to my father's name. And we happen to be Levites, so it would be Yoel ben Avinoam HaLevi. When a non-Jew becomes a Jew, what's the father's name going to be, or what's the mother's name going to be? It's not going to be the name of their non-Jewish parents, because the non-Jewish parents don't have Hebrew names, right? So when a non-Jew becomes a Jew, he acquires a spiritual ancestry that goes directly back to Abraham and Sarah, the mother and father of the Jewish people. So a convert to Judaism, let's say he takes on the name Shlomo, right? Like King Solomon, his name in Hebrew is Shlomo. So let's say this new Jew takes on the name Shlomo. So he would become Shlomo ben Avraham v'Sara. Shlomo, the son of Abraham and Sarah. Those now become his Jewish spiritual parents. And it's very important to understand this, because while lineage is important in certain aspects of Judaism, and we give people credit for being descended from King David or from being descended from a great scholar or a great Rebbe, what we don't do is show prejudice against people who don't have such a distinguished lineage. We might mention that people have a distinguished lineage, but we would in no way show prejudice against somebody for not having such a lineage. So it is prohibited specifically, it's a biblical prohibition to in any way make a person feel bad about their lineage, particularly if they're a proselyte, if they're a convert to Judaism. You would never hold that against them. A convert to Judaism is every bit as much of a Jew as somebody who was born Jewish. In every way. We make no distinction. They are in every way a Jew. The problem comes up that's mentioned in this daf is, let's say somebody converts to Judaism and is now living not in the modern state of Israel, which has a secular government and a secular legal system, but in ancient Israel, which has a Torah government, right? Even when there's a king, he is subject to the laws of the Torah. He rules in conjunction with the priests and with the rabbis, and they're supposed to be the law of the Torah is what applies to the Jewish people living in the ancient kingdom of Israel. This does not apply in the modern state of Israel. But under the laws of the ancient Israel, right, Torah Israel, when Israel had a Torah government. So then, if a non-Jew became a Jew, he has the same rights as Jews. But if, God forbid, he dies before he has children, or before she has children, and after, the new Jew, the Jew by choice, acquired land in Israel, and then didn't have children, and then dies. So who inherits that land? The answer is that it's not the non-Jewish family that he came from, because spiritually speaking, he has a new ancestry within Israel. This doesn't apply in the modern state of Israel, right? Now it's a secular legal system, and the inheritance laws are the inheritance laws. But under the Torah law in ancient Israel, what you can't do is land that is attributed to the tribes of Israel, and then a Jew dies, and because he didn't have children, and the next biological heir is a non-Jew, you can't give that land to a non-Jew. It has to be held by Jews. And since this person doesn't have heirs, that land now is essentially up for grabs by the Jews who live in that area and who are sort of, quick-witted enough to go in and acquire that land. Now, it's sort of like the land rush that there was in the United States. It's like whoever's going to get there first and claim it is going to get it. But they're going to have to do an act of acquisition. And that's why this law is being brought into our daf now. What is going to be the act of acquisition? One way to do it is to enclose the land, right? If it didn't have a fence around it and you built a fence around it, okay, then you improve the land by creating an enclosure, and that would be a strong enough action to make the acquisition valid. What would not be a strong enough action to call it an acquisition is to just throw some seeds on the ground, even if they land in a crack in the ground and germinate and start growing. Why? Because all you did is throw seeds on the ground. When the land improved because those seeds took root and started to become plants, whether they were seed crops or ornamental crops or even weeds, you could say that the land is improved because before it was dirt, now is plants growing on it. But the person who just threw seeds on the ground does not get credit for improving the land. And when the seeds grow into plants, who gets the credit for that? God. It's like as if God is the farmer. So just letting seeds go there, and then when they grow into plants, it's as if they did it on their own. They don't obviously do it on their own. They do it because God created a world in which plants grow. So it's like God gets the credit, but no one acquires the land just by throwing seeds on it. If you plow the land, that's a different situation. If you plow the land, let me just open this, then it's considered that you improved it. My computer's never done that before. Oh well, we'll figure that out later. Excuse me. Okay, there we go. So then it's considered that you improved it if you plowed it. So Bill, you asked that question yesterday. We saw that one of these karpefs that is valid for carrying can become invalid if somebody plants seed crops in it. And you ask, well, what if you just plant a little bit and then those plants grow wild? So it would seem from today's teaching that plants growing by themselves are not going to have a legal validity, and certainly not the same way as plowing and planting. That's a different situation, has a different legal validity in these cases. Okay, next question. If you have a karpef that was created not for the purpose of a dwelling, so we know that its maximum size is the 5,000 square cubits. If we're going to carry there on Shabbos, if it was created originally for the purpose of a dwelling, it can be much bigger, but it wasn't created for a dwelling. It's exactly, and this time it's too big. It's not 5,000 square cubits. It's 7,500 square cubits. Okay. But then we put a roof over the excess portion. So we have an image like that, right? So this one it's way too big. It's 7,500 square cubits, or 3 base sa. But then we take a roof and go over 1/3 of it, and what's left is exactly the right size. So are we going to be permitted to carry in it because we put that roof over 1/3 of it? Rava says no. Just the fact that you put a roof over 1/3 is not going to change it. Rabbi Zera says yes, it is going to do it. It's going to change the status of that enclosure, and we're going to be able to carry at least in the area that is unroofed and which now has been reduced in size. So the Gemara will say, well, this seems to be the same question as the case of a roofed veranda. So that's like this, where you have an area outdoors that has a roof but no sides. It's just a roof without walls. And are we going to be able to carry underneath that roof? So Rav says, yes, you can carry in it, and Shmuel says no, right? Because the question is that an enclosure? That's the question. Is it an enclosure? According to Rav, it is, because he subscribes to the principle that you would extend the edges of the roof down to the ground as if there are walls there, and Shmuel does not subscribe to that principle. Next case. We have, it's very interesting, we have a karpef, we have this enclosure that was originally built not for the residents, but it abuts a courtyard, right? So right now the wall is missing, but imagine that wall was there. So there was a walled-in courtyard where we could certainly carry, and there was a walled-in enclosure that was the correct size. It was 5,000 square cubits exactly, or just let's say a hair under. So it was permitted to carry in both places, though for a different reason. One, because it was enclosed in the right size, under 5,000 square cubits, and the other because it was the courtyard of a dwelling. Okay, that's the case. And then the wall falls down. So the wall between the courtyard and the karpef falls down. So now the question is, can we carry in the karpef? Can we carry in that enclosure that we certainly could when the wall was there, but now the wall fell down? So Rabbi Zera is going to be the first to weigh in, and he's going to say, no, you can't carry there anymore, because it was exactly 2 base seh, it was exactly 5,000 square cubits. Now the wall fell down. It opens up into a courtyard. There's clearly more space that is contiguous with the old space. Now it's too large because it wasn't originally built as a dwelling space, as a courtyard for a dwelling. It was built as something else. So now we cannot carry. Rav Yosef is going to object to Rabbi Zera's analysis. He's going to say, what are you talking about? We could carry, before that wall fell down, we could carry in both places. In the enclosure, because it was the maximum size, and in the courtyard, because it was the courtyard of a dwelling. Now the wall falls down. The courtyard is a place where for sure you can carry. So are we going to say that because the enclosure, the karpef, now opens into a place where it's permitted to carry, that area that's permitted to carry in is going to somehow prohibit the enclosure from carrying there? It doesn't make sense. Opening into a place where we can carry shouldn't make it that we now no longer can carry. If anything, it should be a larger space where we can carry throughout it, according to what Rav Yosef is saying. Abaye answers him, and he says, okay, well, look, you're talking about a law as Rabbi Shimon understands it. Rabbi Shimon says that we can carry from the courtyard into the karpef. Okay, and I think he's saying that when the wall is standing and there's an entrance there, we're going to be able to carry from one to another. I think I need to understand that a little bit better. I mean, if it's the same owner, that might make sense to me. If not, I have to think about that a little bit more. But the important principle is according to Abaye, but even Rabbi Shimon would agree that in this case it doesn't work. Why? Because the enclosure was exactly 5,000 square cubits. And when the wall fell down, the area that was literally occupied by the wall is now not occupied by a wall. And so the enclosure, the karpef, has grown by a little bit, and therefore it's now bigger than its maximum size. Let's say it's 5,010 square cubits. So now carrying is not going to be permitted in the enclosure, and therefore you're not going to be able to carry from the courtyard into the enclosure. And even Rabbi Shimon would agree, says Abaye. Rav Chisda says, Well, listen, we can still carry in the courtyard no matter what, because a courtyard can be really large. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have that 5,000 square cubit limit. So, well, sorry. Come on. So the fact that we opened this whole enclosure into that courtyard is not going to change the fact that we can carry in the courtyard, says Rav Chisda. But in the karpef, which is now a little bigger than 5,000, so even though there's no barrier between them, we know what the line is. In the courtyard, we can carry. In the karpef, in that other enclosure, we cannot. So the Gemara says, well, that doesn't quite make sense. If it does make sense, it must be because the courtyard, that wall that was breached to go into the enclosure, it still has remnants on either side. In other words, we can still see the fourth wall of the courtyard. It's been breached, but because it has that top and bottom section, it's like we can still see clearly four walls around the courtyard. And that's what's going to permit us to still carry in the courtyard, though not in the enclosure. But what if it's the other way around? What if the enclosure is wider than the courtyard? Like in this situation. Now there's no remnants of the wall in the courtyard. Are we still going to be permitted to carry in the courtyard even though we can't carry in the enclosure, which is now a little too big, a little bit over 5,000 cubits? That's the question. And the answer is yes, we can still carry in the courtyard. Therefore, it's not because of those remnants of the fourth wall. Rather, it's simply because the courtyard has no size limit. The fact that we've opened a bigger area onto the courtyard just means we can, it doesn't change the status of the courtyard. We can carry there. It's not because of the remnants of the fourth wall. Then we're given a case that is sort of based on what we've been talking about. And we're going to analyze it. So now we have a karpef that was originally enclosed not for the purpose of a dwelling, but it abuts a big house, a mansion. An orchard is planted in that karpef, and so we're not going to have, we're going to have carrying in it. I think because of the size, right? The issue here is the size. Let me just read how it's exactly written. A certain orchard was adjacent to the wall of a mansion. The orchard was larger than 2 besa, so it was larger than 5,000 square cubits, but it was originally enclosed for the purpose of a residence. It was enclosed for the purpose of a residence by a wall. Now that wall, part of the wall, is a house itself, right? So it was originally enclosed to be... Here we go. It was originally enclosed to be the courtyard of that house, and the house itself forms one of the walls, or is part of one of the walls of the orchard. Later, so was it formed to be for a residence? Later, they planted trees there, but the orchard. So we would think maybe the orchard, because we've seen that before, that if you plant an orchard, that's going to take it out of the realm of carrying. But that's not said here. Rather, one day, the outer wall of the mansion, which also served as a wall for the orchard, collapsed. Rav Bevai thought to say that we can rely upon one of the mansion's inner walls to serve as a partition for the orchard and thereby permit one to carry there in the future as well. So the wall of the house fell down. Rav Bevai says, yeah, but okay, the outer wall of the house fell down, but there's still walls inside that house, which we could now use as the barrier that surrounds the orchard. And this is where we get the Talmudic insult. Rav Papi said to him, because you come and we're coming to the end of the class, so if you have questions, put them in the comments. Rav Papi said to him, because you come from truncated people, mula'e, people, truncated people, as Rav Bevai's family traced their lineage to the house of Eli, the high priest, all of whose descendants were destined to be short-lived. You speak truncated matters, as the inner wall cannot be relied upon at all, and that is because these walls were made for the inside of the mansion, and they were not made for the outside. That is, they were not designed from the outset to serve as partitions for the orchard. So I said earlier, it's kind of a backhanded compliment, right? I mean, the fact that this Rav Bevi can trace his lineage all the way back to a high priest of Israel is pretty amazing, right? So he says it like an insult, and what he's referring to is that, so Eli had a very positive role, or let's say mixed role, is in the story of Hannah, who was very sad because she couldn't have children. She was, she was married to a man who had 2 wives. The other wife had a lot of children. She was not able to conceive. She was very sad about it. She went up she went to Shiloh, where the tabernacle was standing at this time. This is before Jerusalem became the center, before the temple was built. It's where the tabernacle was. And she was praying with all her might, and her lips were moving as she was praying. And the high priest came over to her and rebuked her for being intoxicated, for being drunk and coming into the temple, which is forbidden. She said, "I'm not intoxicated. I'm a woman with a broken heart." And he realized that she was telling the truth. She certainly wasn't intoxicated. And he blessed her that her prayers should be answered. And they were answered. And her son that was born out of that moment was the prophet Samuel, Shmuel, who would eventually, anoint the first king of Israel, King Saul. So Samuel was a really big deal, and it's actually from his mother Hannah that we learn about the correct way to pray, which is that our lips should be moving silently, but moving. Unfortunately, Eli had 2 sons who were priests, and they were corrupt, and he did not rebuke them, or he didn't keep a close enough eye on them. And so ultimately, a prophet came to Eli and said, that your house is going to be cursed. You're going to lose the priesthood. And in fact, people are going to die young in your family. So I don't know if they kept dying young for many generations. Maybe when Rav Papi is insulting Rav Bevi and saying, you come from truncated people, he's saying on the one hand, you're just wrong about this ruling. It's not that you're going to die young. It's that you see things cut off and you don't see the full picture so that you can give the correct ruling of the law. But I'm saying it's not just an insult. It's also a compliment. Not everybody can trace their lineage back to a high priest of Israel. At any rate, it was included in the Gemara. That insult got written in. And we see that from time to time, that the sages will speak very harshly to each other. And we don't like it, right? We don't like it. It's a big value in Judaism that we can argue passionately, but we're not going to bring people's lineage and identity into it. Nevertheless, we shouldn't, judge these conversations and the way that they address each other according to modern standards. That would be a mistake in many ways. We have to judge them according to the kinds of language that they use and the dialogues that they had in their age. And whatever the case is, it was the editors of the Gemara included that exchange in the Talmud. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let me look at your questions and comments. There are a few. Bill Eldridge, question about the inner fence, or I suppose the pillar. Does it have to be permanent? Can you pack it up Sunday morning and put it back up on Thursday night? Better safe than sorry. And it's valid. Come back tomorrow. You're always one step ahead, Bill. It's a great question, and that question is going to come up in Daf Chaf Zion, tomorrow's page, Chaf Vav, 26, page 26, will be coming tomorrow, and it was a kind of temporary partition that was put up on a Friday afternoon to permit carrying on Saturday. So the answer seems to be yes, you can put up temporary partitions to serve the job on Saturday, but of course it's not going to be a simple answer. There's some qualifications to that. We'll talk about it tomorrow. Yosef Shum, is self-conversion ever discussed in the Talmud? I heard somewhere somebody mentioned something like that. We actually mentioned it in Tractate Shabbos. Somebody who just was following the law but didn't have the proper law available. So self-conversion, it's not really a real thing. Because look, anybody who's on this journey with us sees how complex all these laws are. You really can't learn it on your own. There are some mentions to it happening at the times of the Talmud, but it is definitely not a legal practice today. For somebody to convert, they need to study. They need to study in an organized way, and eventually they have to come before a beis din, be questioned. Not only in terms of their knowledge and how they've been learning and how they've been practicing, that they're prepared to become a practicing Jew, but also to make certain declarations about throwing in their lot with the Jewish people, as it were. Lucy Rom Johnson, if the wall falls down, does not the whole thing become a courtyard? See, that's the question, right? It's unclear from the discussion. It doesn't really get answered. That's the obvious question. Doesn't the whole thing become a courtyard? The answer doesn't. It doesn't seem to support that. Where was that? A karpef that's fully breached into a courtyard. Here's the modern halacha. If the entire wall of an enclosure that separates it from a courtyard is breached, and the enclosure is exactly the area of 2 Beisa, it is prohibited to carry in the enclosure because of the width of the walls counts toward the area of the 2 Sa. In addition, if the courtyard is not wider than the enclosure and nothing remains of the wall separating it from the enclosure, then it is prohibited to carry in the courtyard as well. So actually that halakha seems to indicate that those 2 remnants are significant that we talked about in this example. So that's what's going to allow us to carry in the courtyard. But at any rate, from that analysis, we see that the answer to your question is no. Definitely the enclosure doesn't become part of the courtyard just because that wall fell down. You could ask, can we turn the courtyard can we turn that enclosure into part of the courtyard? And I think the answer would be that we have to rebuild some part of that fence so that now it's built for the purpose of being part of the dwelling, which it was not before. Neil in Virginia, Lynn first. The woman who erected a partition to claim a convert's property, and Rav Nachman decided for the man who dug a pit. Why the detail of a convert owner when this is about the method of how to claim? Well, I guess it's because the convert he didn't have children and he has no other relatives. Spiritually speaking, he has no other relatives. If there was a Jew that died and had no other relatives, it still might go. It might not be sort of open season. In ancient Israel, it would have gone to members of his tribe, right? So now maybe they need to do an acquisition in the same way, but the convert, the one thing that he doesn't have is membership in a tribe. Now you might say, well, he acquired land somewhere, and all of the land of ancient Israel is divided by tribes, so maybe it needs to go to members of that tribe where the land that he acquired sits. A little bit unclear why they made that detail, but I think it's just a shorthand for no other relatives. Okay. Neil, while I understand the legal requirements for property acquisition were not followed, it troubled me that the wife of a convert, who was 1, in mourning, and 2, may not have been given the same opportunity to learn the details of the law as a woman, and 3, may not have even been Jewish, was at a disadvantage. Well, that's not clear to me. The woman who was unable to claim, she wasn't the wife of the convert. She was just a woman who tried to take the land. If there's 2 converts, well, they're both Jews, and he dies, she inherits. It's not like it wouldn't go to the wife. Sure, it would go to the wife, as far as I can tell. And Sharon Fran Brooks, final question. So why isn't the enclosed space just considered an enlargement of the courtyard, and you can carry throughout the entire area? So we just covered that question. It's not, because it was originally enclosed not to be part of a courtyard, and we haven't gone through a process to redesignate it that way. The fact that that wall fell down is not enough. We'd have to build up some other part of the wall if we were actually going to, make the courtyard and the enclosure all one courtyard. And that makes sense, right? Right now, we're talking about the law of carrying. Property ownership is a different question, and designated what kind of land it is. Just the fact that a fence fell is not going to be enough to transform that enclosure into courtyard. That space has not yet been transformed. It could be, but we haven't gone through that procedure yet. Okay, that's what I've got for us this evening. I hope you'll join us tomorrow at noon Pacific. Since we'll be preparing for Shabbos, it's noon Pacific is our class time on Fridays. Have a great evening. This is challenging material. You can give yourself a pat on the back because you're really wrestling with Torah when you're learning Eruvin, and you're doing a great job being here. All the best.